before I showed him what I wrote, he said, I talked to my colleagues and we have a lot of doubts about being able to sell this. And could you make it about a bigger subject? Like about maybe say father figures in American culture, like television fought, not just Andy Griffith, but like Bill Cosby. And I was like, sure. And then my marriage ended immediately. And so it was at the exact same time that was happening. So I was trying to navigate it. At one point, I was just like, I'm not going to do that book.
Welcome to The Book I Had to Write. I'm Paul Zakshevsky. My guest today is writer and poet Evan Dalton Smith. Now, back in 2013, Evan published a long essay about his childhood hero, Andy Griffith. Andy Griffith had just died the year before, and Evan's piece ran in the LA Review of Books. It was partly a look at Griffith's lasting impact on pop culture, especially in his most famous role, that of the wise, decent Sheriff Andy Taylor. That role had a lot of resonance for Evan, who had discovered the Andy Griffith Show as a young kid growing up in a troubled house without a dad. But Evan was also interested in exploring the nature of the show's fan base, especially fans of its fictitious location. It's called Mayberry. Mayberry is a town based on Mount Airy, North Carolina, where Griffith grew up. But here in the show, it's transformed into a mythic place, full of funny, bumbling characters and enduring small-town values. In other words, a place that never existed at all. In 2014, Evan sold a book based on the essay, and as you'll hear, Evan hoped to get it finished and published quickly. But life had other plans. Evan's life got upended by a painful divorce, among other changes. All this provided material for his book. Part hybrid memoir and cultural study, Searching for Andy Griffith is just out from UNC Press. The book is a meditation on the powerful attachments we form to pop culture icons, and it's a look at what it means to be a good man and a good father. Evan Dalton Smith has published poetry and essays in Slate, the Paris Review, Plowshares, the LA Times, and the New Yorker. And these days, he lives and writes in Ipswich, Massachusetts. I thought the book was compulsively readable and so engaging, just like my conversation with Evan himself. I hope you enjoy it. So, welcome, Evan. I'm really thrilled to have you on the show.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak with you. I associate the times we used to hang out in New York as really wonderful memories, and it's nice to reconnect with you after a good long time.
Yeah, me too. It seems to be a theme this season. So I want to ask you first, why was this, Looking for Andy Griffith, why was this the book you had to write?
Well, it was the book I've been writing all my life in a lot of ways, and the stories we tell over and over again. But the evolution of the book is when Andy Griffith died in 2012, I discovered I was grieving for someone I'd never met who was a television actor or a movie actor. And so I initially wanted to investigate why. And so I pitched an essay uh, to the LA Review of Books and wrote an essay for them that next year. And I was also really interested in the kind of subculture around fans of the Andy Griffith Show and people that had the same experience as me. I discovered a lot of people shared that kind of feeling, um, and the nostalgia for something that never existed was really fascinating to me. It also coincided with me selling the book, writing a proposal and selling the book was pretty much in parallel with my life falling apart in New York City and trying to relocate to New England to follow my, family so I could be with my children. And so that became part of the narrative of the book. I was in survival mode for a lot of those years, and so a lot of it was delayed because you can't really form new thoughts when you have that level of stress in your life. And that actually ties into the book because the reason people embrace these nostalgic shows is because in times of like high stress, it allows them to relive an earlier experience, and they're experiencing cognitive load where they can't form new memories. So like so during the pandemic, ratings for the Andy Griffith Show went up, but it's been on television for 60 years. So it's a unique show, and I became fascinated with it.
For folks who may not be super familiar with Andy Griffith or the Andy Griffith Show, could you give kind of a very quick thumbnail sketch of what the show was, what the flavor of the show is?
Yeah, it was a sitcom at kind of the height of packaging deals, but Andy put the feelers out to do a show because his film career was flagging. He had been put in film jail after a huge flop called Onion Head, but his career was kind of meteoric in the 1950s, and he came up out of the first wave of the folk revival, but he had a best-selling comedy record. It was kind of a comedy monologue. But the show itself, they had lightning in a bottle. They were never able to reproduce it. And they tried and failed in the 1970s. And, it was just like this wonderful combination of things that I don't know, for some reason just resonated. It was nostalgic for something that never quite existed. It was really the writers were thinking about the 1930s, I think, when they were children. To a lot of people, it seems like a real place, and it also, as I'm kind of a TV and comedy geek a little bit, and it influenced a lot of shows that exist today. Like I interviewed Emily Spivey as a writer and producer. She used to write for Saturday Night Live, and she's made a lot of shows. And she said that Parks and Recreation, that Pawnee, Indiana was Mayberry. The Greg Daniels, who had a hand in that show, that Danny Griffith Show is his favorite show.
So, Andy Griffith, definitely a great comic talent, even though on the show he plays kind of a straight man.
Yes.
That's his persona. And he also, I should say, so he plays this character, Sheriff Andy Taylor, and who seems, folksy, and more than anything, just very decent, like a very decent guy. Given all the time that you spent researching Andy Griffith, did you feel like there was distance between the character he played on the show and the man who was, or where do you settle with that?
Oh yeah, I was way more interested in the mythology around the Andy Griffith Show, and this idea of a kind of like steady, reliable father figure who was strong but not brutal. So that a lot of people I talked to, that was their model. The Andy Griffith the man was, and would admit that he was completely not that character. He was an actor that created this character, but he became so conflated with the character, he became trapped and couldn't get work for a while, and he kind of reinvented himself in the mid 70s as a kind of villain in TV melodramas. He was offered very few film roles. So that fascinated me too, and the fact that Monterey, North Carolina, which is a mill town in north western, it's kind of the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, and it's where my mom and dad grew up. And my mother especially was poorer than Andy Griffith was, but Andy Griffith was poor, and his dad worked at the furniture factory, but he was an only child, so he had better clothes than a lot of his friends that lived on the wrong side of the tracks, and he would get beaten up because of that. And he escaped this town where he felt like a second-class citizen, and this is in his own words. Andy was fascinating. I did discover some, peccadillos, but I didn't really emphasize them too much. I mean, there was another writer who wrote a book who kind of revealed his affairs, and he talked about his temper and kind of brooding anxiety, and he was vocal about that. And I think in some ways that was calculated to try to get better, more dramatic roles. Writers for the show, Ev Greenbaum recounted that Andy was laughing so hard he punched through a wall. And Ev Greenbaum described him. I didn't put this in the book, but I was really fascinated by this expression. Greenbaum described him as a large man with large appetites.
Wow. Like very Falstaffian.
Yeah, he was an interesting character, and that he was trapped in this role. And he eventually, towards the end of his life, I think he gave himself over to it. But he used to argue with people about Mount Airy, and he would insist that Mayberry wasn't Mount Airy, and he resented being kind of like people whistling the Andy Griffith Show theme song behind him at airports.
Wow.
But at the end of his life, he talked about it. It was like the best 8 years of his life, and they did make this kind of wonderful sitcom. And it's not perfect by any means, but it fascinates me how much people place on it. They're looking for, it's like in, ancient times when people would let the Aeneid fall open to a page and look at point at a passage to like try to tell their fortune. It's a little bit like that. Like they're looking for messages, but people are taking the material and creating new material. So that really fascinates me. It's a little bit, I think the analog is Star Trek in the culture, but it's not. But it's different. It's in some ways it's more intimate.
Your book is subtitled A Father's Journey,
Hmm.
and you alluded to this kind of second strand, this autobiographical strand in the book that encompasses a lot of different pieces, early experiences with the Andy Griffith Show, but also what was happening at home, the early death of your father,
Hmm.
and then also, as you alluded to, this time after a divorce in which things kind of fell apart for you.
Hmm.
I guess I wanted to ask, what, tell me more about that kind of search for this mythic father. I mean, it really resonated for me.
Hmm.
As you mentioned, Andy Griffith, at least the character he plays is this, kind of tough, but very decent guy. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, I when I realized I was grieving when he died, that was the impetus for the book. I, of course, kind of went back and looked at what were the things that made that happen. And so my dad's early death in a car accident when I was 5 years old, and my mother's subsequent addiction to narcotics, which kept her isolated and depressed and suicidal, which is a side effect of that particular drug, which actually gave me permission to work on my next book, which is about that. So the Andy Griffith book, exploring that aspect of my childhood, made me want. When I started looking into that narcotic, that's the proposal I'm working on now. I'm really excited about it, and I want to do a similar kind of approach to the material. But yeah, I met a writer who he heard I was writing a book about Andy Griffith, and he pulled me aside. He was like, I had a terrible childhood. I had no models, and that show raised me. I was kind of on my own a lot. Uh, so it was a big part of who I looked to for a male role model. And I know it was a character. He was not that in life. He was kind of estranged from his kids in a lot of ways. But I know he did his best, and he was just a man like anybody else. The small town where I grew up in North Carolina was not so unlike Andy Griffith's hometown of Mount Airy. It was a dry county. Churches were prominent. We had a sole high school that the community rallied around. Still, in this little idyllic town, the dad next door beat his sons without mercy. A lady down the street shot her drunken husband. A teenager fell into a coma after tumbling off a skateboard and fracturing his skull. A state trooper's son, just out of high school, offered all us boys playing kick the can $1 if we'd let him give us blowjobs. The dentist's son shot himself in the chest. The coroner's son hung himself. The dad I'd known was long dead. My natural father forever estranged. My mother silent behind her bedroom door, trapped by depression and prescription narcotics. When I heard that famous whistling theme song at 5:30 p.m., I ran inside, knelt on the floor, and turned my face fully toward the screen. I came inside when I was called.
So, Evan, I wanted to shift gears and ask you a bit about writing this book. You mentioned to me earlier in the interview, and also it's in the book itself, that the book started off as an essay that you wrote for the LA Review of Books. And I wanted to ask you about the journey of turning this from an essay into a full length manuscript. What did that look like for you?
Well, it was a little harrowing. There was a lot of pressure on selling the book to be able to navigate this new life. And it was a hard book to sell for my agent. She very kindly, when we first met, she's like, "This is a weird little book, but you can make a career out of writing a lot of weird little books." And I think it was because of the memoir and the cultural biography part of it. Before that agent sold the book, I had a different agent who was a perfectly nice person. But before I even finished the proposal, we were put in touch from the essay because of the essay. And it's like, oh, when you write a proposal, I'll be happy to see it. It was something like that. Before I showed him what I wrote, he said, I talked to my colleagues and we have a lot of doubts about being able to sell this. And it's like, and could you make it about a bigger subject? Like about maybe say father figures in American culture, like television fought, not just Andy Griffith, but like Bill Cosby. and and I was like, sure. And then my marriage ended immediately. And so it was at the exact same time that was happening. So I was trying to navigate it. And I was just at one point I was just like, I'm not gonna do that book. And it turned out to be a great thing that I didn't write a book about Bill Cosby. But I found another agent based on what I'd worked on who she did have a hard time selling the book, but I'm grateful she did. And, even though it was a small press, they done a wonderful job and they put it in front of their catalog and have been very supportive.
And what about the experience of putting yourself in the book? There's much more of you in the book than there is in the original essay. And I'm kind of curious to ask you about that.
So the journey was long. The writing, I did struggle putting myself into the narrative. Like I added a lot more about my life than I intended to, particularly, some of the kind of more harrowing aspects of being a child of someone with a narcotics addiction. And I talked to my children about it because, it was difficult to write about it. But then once it was done, I was like, then it was like, oh, people are going to ask me about this now, and people are going to know. My mom passed away in 2001, and as a result of this long addiction to this narcotic. My son and I were chatting over dinner, and I was telling him about this. I was trying to explain his grandmother to him because he never met her. She died before he was born, and I was saying how proud she would be of him. This was when we were visiting the Coast Guard Academy, and he wanted to help people. And she was a nurse. One time when I was in college, she asked me to go to the grocery store with her late at night. It's like 11 o'clock at night. It was like a 24-hour grocery store, and we were in a shotgun robbery, and everyone hit the ground and were whimpering. And I was I was in another aisle, and I went like duck walking through the aisles looking for my mom, to try to pull her out the back, and to make sure she was okay. I found her trying to make her way to the front where the robbers were to see if someone had been shot
Wow.
because it was the loudest boom you ever heard when they fired it into the ceiling. They fired the gun into the ceiling. So she was the type of person that would run towards danger, but was floored by this addiction for most of my childhood. But so I was telling my son this, and he was like, "This should be your next book, Dad." So the Andy Griffith book gave me the tools to research it and also talk about the personal aspects as well. And I talked with my sister and my aunts and my cousins, and everyone's on board with it.
I'm really glad that you said all that, and I'm really glad you wrote those personal sections. As hard as I can imagine they were, they are actually for me some of the most compelling pieces of the book. In fact, I kept kind of moving ahead in different parts to kind of find out more about some of the stories that you were telling. So I appreciated that. You alluded to the fact that writing this was a challenging experience, and I saw you just did a interview with Poets and Writers magazine, where I think you used to work.
Yes.
And
I don't think the editor knew that I used to work there.
really, that was
It
funny.
it was over 10 years ago.
And you mentioned in there some of the challenges being things like just basic economics, and you mentioned your own ego as roadblocks. Can you tell me more about those?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a vision for the book initially that was very much like an Esquire piece from the 1960s, or a Joseph Mitchell piece in the New Yorker from the 40s. I was going to be on site everywhere, every place. And I was able to go to New York and North Carolina and a few other places, but I definitely wanted to travel. When I realized I didn't have enough money to do that, there was a lot of flailing around, and I over researched the book. I had enormous amounts of research that didn't make it into the book. And so many lines, so many people I interviewed, I was going to, so that was one part. That's the ego part where like I had to make my peace with it. I had to call people and email people and not travel to where they were. The other aspect, the economic aspect, was just that I was struggling to survive working several jobs. I'm not saying that I wasn't born on third base in so many ways for this world. I know that I was, but when I moved to New England, I couldn't find a job in my field, and I worked at a grocery store during the day. And after a couple of years of that, found a job at night editing obituaries 4 nights a week. And 3 of those years had my son with me full time, and my daughter in 2021 was with me as much as she wanted because she was in school remotely. But so my day would start at 6:45, 7, and end about 10:30, 11 at night. So anyway, that did not allow for a lot of time. So I make fun of it in the book, like where I had that kind of disastrous dictation, like I was dictating the book. I was really just generating tons of material, and then it turned out to all be like useless, you know. But I would just write I would write in the car, and I would write at night. I learned to write on my phone, which is annoying for the people in my life that they think I'm just, jerking around on my phone. But a lot of times I'm working because if you can focus on it, you can actually do a lot.
It almost sounds like you taught yourself how to write a book by writing this book.
Yeah, I did. I certainly am not going to take as much time for the next book. Yeah, there was a lot of like stops and starts because I was moving and just such upheaval. It took so long. I mean, there's a chapter where at one point I say, it's been so long since this book began that most people have just stopped asking me about it. Like they think it probably already came out and they just missed it, or they just thought I wasn't doing it anymore. But I certainly did not, and I was in a lot of ways. I mean, I thought about it all the time, and I was researching all the time. I had like something like 9 or 10 gigs of information on my computer, and a lot of handwritten notes and audio interviews and stuff.
It's incredible.
Ultimately, I was very kind of willful and presented something to my editor that I thought was interesting and was more the type of book I wanted to write. And I got lucky in that he was on board for it. And he actually told me, he said, Evan, you're lucky in some ways that you turned this in later, because if years ago we might not have been able to get behind a book like this because we were more conservative. UNC Press has more creative nonfiction now and memoir.
wanted to ask you, I mean, the book feels like it feels almost like an anti-biography. You know, the thing it put me in mind of immediately is the Jeff Dyer book Out of Sheer Rage, you know, the
Yes. And I was reading that book right at the beginning of this book. And I mentioned that as a reference. And I really loved Another Bullshit Night in Suck City in terms of just the lyrical aspect of it. And Nick Flynn's a poet, and I write poetry, and it used to be all I wanted to do. So yeah, those influenced it in a lot of ways. I also, gosh, Andy sold a memoir and they just didn't write it.
wow.
So like knowing that and just knowing how private he was, I didn't really want to go too much into his personal. I mean, I talk about it a little bit, but I definitely didn't reveal all the stuff that I actually know. Uh, but I don't know. I just thought that things just for salaciousness wasn't. But the one thing I thought was interesting though was the push for him to run for office. It came from a conversation I had with my son, who's very political minded and wants to go into public service. And we were talking about what if Andy Griffith had run against Jesse Helms. And my son, he was like, the entire geopolitical landscape would be different right now. It
Wow.
basically was that the debate we saw last night wouldn't have ever happened. Putin might not be in power. Trump might not ever come into play. Reagan would have lost.
So, Evan, I want to ask what's changed for you as a result of publishing the book?
Everything has changed, and for the best way. It's an incredible feeling, especially with something that I labored on so long, and that people uh, that were unkind in my life told me that I would never publish a book. So that feels good to have done that. But I feel like I discovered something that is really entertaining to me. And if there's an audience for it, I want to do more of it, which is to tell stories that interweave different aspects of the culture. And because it's how my brain works, and so it's what interests me. Like and you can explore any topic like that. So I feel like I have 1,000 ideas, and if not the book about the pharmaceutical that my mother was addicted to, which is an interesting story because it was banned and there was a fight to get it banned that failed in the 70s, and millions of people were addicted to it, and it was a cash cow for the company that made it, and it didn't do much to ease people's pain. That's why they became addicted to it. But I also am interested in writing a book about hotel lobby bars, so that might be so, and it would be the same thing. I'd interview the people and the stories behind them, and these great spaces. So yeah, I feel really excited about my work ahead, that I have more than enough work to fill the rest of my life. Yeah, that changed, and someone came into my life recently that was directly a result of the book. And that was a complete surprise because I was certainly not looking for anything like that, and so that's been mind-blowingly life changing and for the better. So.
Congratulations. Yeah. So you've been in the midst of a short book tour. I've seen your social media postings. It looks like you. I know you were out here on the West Coast. You've been. You mentioned just down in North Carolina. What's been a particularly compelling? Give me one particularly compelling experience from the road for you.
Well, if I could offer advice to any people that don't have publicists or work closely with a publicist, if you're just relying on your publisher's publicist, I could not afford a publicist, and my publisher's publicist is doing a great job. Don't get me wrong, but touring they don't necessarily always help out with. So my advice is just to get a really early start on it. And I naively waited a little late, so I've just kind of cobbled together a few things. But I love the book launch at Diesel in Brentwood, Santa Monica, California was wonderful, and the people were great. I asked a writer, producer for the show, Bob's Burgers, to be the interlocutor for it. He did a great job. Scott Jacobson, he's from North Carolina, and he gave me the best compliment in the Q&A, and he said that the book reminded him of Ross McElwee's documentary Sherman's March, which is Ross McElwee's also from North Carolina, teaches at Harvard, and I love that documentary, and I love everything he's done. That was a huge thing for me, and I I saw a lot of my mom's friends and family and cousins and things in North Carolina and in Virginia. So that was great too. I'm reading tomorrow in Woodstock, and Rob Spillman is going to be the interlocutor. He's great. And then in New York City with Adele Waldman, because I thought it would be interesting to talk with her because of her novel Help Wanted. She went and worked at a big box store. And so she and I both know how to use a box cutter uh, and put stock on a shelf. So I just thought we might have an interesting conversation.
Evan, this has been so much fun. It's been great to see you again. I just want to thank you again for doing the podcast.
Oh, absolutely, Paul. It's a pleasure speaking with you, and you're a wonderful literary citizen, and I always thought that, and so I'm excited to be included on your podcast. And when you come to Ipswich, look me up, and I'll take you out for fried clams and a beer, or whatever you like.
You got it. You've been listening to my interview with author and poet Evan Dalton Smith. I'm Paul Zakshevsky. If you enjoyed the show, then I hope you'll subscribe in Apple Podcasts. I'm always grateful for reviews and for sharing the show with friends. To get show notes and a transcript, please subscribe to my newsletter at The Book I Want to Write. That's at bookiwanttowrite.substack.com. A couple times a month, I also publish short essays about writing mindset, developments in publishing, personal essays, and more. If you're working on your own book you have to write, or you want to get started, maybe I can help. Find out more about me and my book coaching at bookiwanttowrite.substack.com. That's bookiwanttowrite.substack.com. And thanks again for listening.